好的，朋友们，这是我们来啊，这里又是老朋友 ZiggyD 采访 GG 的这个两位制作人。那左边的 Jonathan 就是负责 POE2 的，然后右边的 Mark 是负责 POE1 的。然后这一个是专门关于 POE2 的访谈。如果你要看这个之前 ZiggyD 对这个他们的 POE1 相关内容的采访的话，可以去看小象翻译的那个 Q&A 视频。那我们就来看这个 POE2 专门的一个采访。
Is melee bad?
In POE1?
Just in general in action RPGs, it always seems to be, regardless of its state even.
是啊，就说为什么近战在这个通常的这种 ARPG 暗黑 like 里边都很坏，都很差啊，这就是一个很大的一个问题。
The butt of the joke in some capacity, right? Why is that?
I guess it's inherently harder to create good melee than it is to create good ranged. You don't have to worry so much about animation with ranged attacks and so on. Like there's just a lot. It's just a lot easier to do. With melee, it's like, okay, not only do you have like a bunch of animation challenges, you've got a bunch of control challenges, you've got like a whole, like it's just a lot. It's a lot of things. And then even when you come to balance, there's a lot of concerns, like, you know, there's the expectation of if you're close to a monster that you should therefore have more defenses, which is like in some cases reasonable, in other cases not. There's like a whole lot of challenges around monster AI. It's kind of like it's just a much harder thing to do. Like if we made a ranged only game, we would be having a much easier time.
所以近战我觉得最大的问题就是你永远是挨打的。挨打的话，那么有些游戏挨打的惩罚是非常非常严重的，比如说非常早期的 POE 啊，不要说贴手背这种加难度，就是你在无情难度开局，然后发现你什么都没有啊，身上一点护甲是一点闪避都没有的情况，这种情况的话，近战也是超级难玩的啊。那你总不可能让近战不挨打，那这样怪物的这个技能设计不就白费了吗？那就得有一个方案解决一下，让近战跟远程都相对的平衡一点点。所以
yeah, not having to worry about all this melee stuff. It wouldn't be unreasonable to say that it's part of why we even started the project, because like it really was down to changing the rigs of the player characters, and the reason we wanted to change the rigs is because the animators were not happy with the rigs in POE1. They weren't able to make animations for it. Like in order to fix melee, we had to restart the character stuff from scratch, and that's what led into all of the things that went down the road and then to making a sequel. So yeah, like
所以 POE2 近战牛逼。
Answer to how to fix melee was make a new game, apparently.
Make Puzzle Pixel 2. Yeah. You're taking a decent crack at it in POE1 right now, but...
For sure, but the thing is, like, we're still limited in what we can do. Like, we can make a lot of balance changes, and that will help, and that's needed.
Yep.
But it isn't the same as what you need to do to really make, like, a proper action game. Like POE1 isn't going to get to the point where, like, the melee combat feels satisfying in the same way that a single-player action game would. Yeah, it's just simply because we don't have the ability to do all the animation stuff we need to do.
This was the opening salvo of a great interview I got to have with Jonathan and Mark, lead producers and designers on Path of Exile 2, during my recent visit to their studio. I really wanted to try and dig a little deeper on their efforts to try and make the best possible action RPG by critiquing it from the perspective of melee. Precisely because it's so hard to do right. Most stat-heavy RPGs simply don't. If you start describing deep, satisfying melee combat, then people will assume you're talking about an action game, like a Souls-like or a fighting game, even.
对，就是所有人都在说打击感这个东西，我相信有一些视频就是很好的科普打击感，但是这些东西在我们通常意义里边的暗黑 like 里边都不存在。你说暗黑4那个特别有打击感，我觉得也不是很有，最后纪元好像也没有太多，然后这个 POE 的话更是很少很少，所以这种东西的话，就是说近战在这类游戏的处境都是比较艰难的。
It's generally safer to...
当然，之前暗黑4那一个蛮子的那个数值做的是真的是太离谱了，所以导致你打上去没什么反馈感的话，一锤子蹦出来一个几亿的数字，那也是秒了吧？那这就是导致了这些游戏近战体验好的话，你伤害只能到秒的地步，不然的话，你跟怪物缠斗啊什么的游戏体验会很差，就是你会发现你的伤害不够去。打死对面，然后对面的话招招致命，你又不得不去离一个怪物很近的这种战斗范围，基本上很多技能很难去躲掉。
To abstract the melee combat experience in games like Path of Exile to stats and dice rolls, especially in online ones. That's just because if there are really any flaws in the action of the combat in the game, well, Melee will hold up a magnifying glass to it. So because of that, I played exclusively Melee on my trip, and we spent a good half an hour deep diving into it during our chat. And I think they're getting close here. I felt a hair's breadth away from something pretty special, particularly as I got a few hours deep into my Monk gameplay, where I started to feel like I was getting really close to realizing a combat experience that I've never had in a game like this before. So let's find out how they're trying to finally make Melee not the butt of the joke in action RPGs.
I mean, the main thing really is, I mean, you have to look at action games.
等一下，这个 boss 是那个什么？是迷雾之王？
that I've never had in a game like this before. So let's find out how
这 boss 就是迷雾之王。然后祭坛，难怪这个赛季那个祭坛改成跟迷雾之王相关、迷虫赛季相关的东西。
They're trying to finally make Melee not the butt of the joke.
原来你在 POE2里面有戏份。
I mean, the main thing really is, I mean, you have to look at action games and look at what they're doing. Like, if you look at what really good action games do, it's not just like you make a single animation for attack and call it done. You have to have all sorts of variations depending on character states. You have to have like things about, you know, for closing and so on. You have to make sure that you've got control as much as possible throughout the course of a melee attack, which is something that then, you know, even more animations and things to do, like, you know, there's lots of things like that. It's just it's a lot of small details, but ultimately what you need to focus on is those sort of action game stuff. And I think there aren't that many kind of like online games that really do that, you know,
这个地震时间太久了。
not that we're an MMO exactly, but you know, in that kind of like online game genre that have really done a lot of that. There are some, right? Especially in Korea, there's been a lot of attempts at doing, like more attempts at doing that kind of, you know, action game that's online thing. It's just something I think that you know is inherently hard.
Yeah, I guess it's something to do with like the physicality of an action RPG is much more important. You're not just, you know, tab targeting and then just saying you can make Melee good through the stats, through the numbers.
For sure, yeah.
You can't. It's not just the numbers.
For sure, no. And honestly, like, I mean, numbers are important, but yeah, they're not the most important thing for this. That's it's a different ballgame entirely.
So you mentioned like changing the animations, animation cancelling, be able to dodge roll, things like
absolutely,
that.
Right.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That you need both big combos and those skills that link together, but you also need something that you can maybe cast for free or spam or some sort of staple melee attack. Do you feel like you're kind of building that design area out there?
So it's sort of interesting actually, because one of the things in that we've done recently in POE2, which wasn't in the build, I believe that you have, is that melee, basic melee is actually now, basic default attack is now a supportable skill on your character. So effectively you can add support to it. It actually, technically speaking, it levels behind the scenes. You don't have to actually like gain experience for it or anything like that, but like technically it levels up in the way, so it's got the same scaling factor as all the other skills do, and that means that default attack actually becomes like part of your build, and of course it's a free action, and all the mana costs that would be any mana multipliers that would be on support gems obviously multiply with 0, so you can use them for free on default attack, and that actually becomes part of the kind of like the staple, and that's actually an interesting one that was a little controversial because it actually I find that it helps a lot, because you do need that kind of like to make the big attacks land more interestingly. You need to have like other sort of moments of just like a basic default kind of attack, and we tried to do that initially with I mean, so something like in POE1 Heavy Strike was effectively supposed to be the, like, you know, default attack replacement, as it were, and in the end it was kind of like, okay, what is Heavy Strike really doing that default attack isn't doing if default attack leveled up and if the animation was good and if, you know, like all that sort of stuff, you know what I mean? Like there was no real distinction there. So effectively the way that POE2 looks at it is that all weapons have a built-in skill effectively that's free, and you can support that skill. And so that's true for caster weapons as well, where they've got like the built-in fireball or whatever it is. You can support those as well. And that is a sort of the way that, the way it works in POE2 now.
Yeah, I noticed the two-hand default attack was separate to the one hand, and I could use that to weapon swap.
That's correct. Yes. So effectively, that's the way we look. Since we look at it that way now, it's like each weapon has its skill. That like that default attack is part of that weapon, and so that means that you can, exactly as you said, you can swap like that.
It is important in that regard, though. It's like one problem we're having, or challenge we're having to overcome, though, is now that the default attack does get support and level up, if it happens to be one of the better choices, then you actually feel like using skills is no longer worthwhile. That is a challenge we've had to kind of work around and make sure. And I would say there's still more work to do there, because what we often found is that people were playing this, and then over time they might have learned, because we didn't have correct balance on number of our skills or whatever, that they're like, wait, why am I even using this skill? I'm just going to default attack all the time, and that can make the game feel quite flat and boring. So there is a fine line to tread there, and we're certainly getting there, but like it's difficult.
It's actually interesting because it
我最大的担忧就是平 A 可能跟大部分的 combo 啊，这个 POE2里边要找的这种组合技啊，这种各种联动效果的话不太兼容，因为平 A 本身是什么都不带的。当然你可以用这个辅助技能池去给它做一些改变，但是还是它本身因为什么特性都不带，所以就算是不知道会怎么去安排，有可能这个辅助会有一些特别改变技能性质的东西，导致它能够成为这种跟各种 BD 融合的一个兼容键，我也说不太清楚。总之目前的话，感觉平 A 能够6连这个想法的话，不算太好。
highlighted issues with bosses where, okay, so default attack, so in general, right, the more targets something hits, the less damage it should do, because the idea is that you're using that, for larger areas and so on. So default attack being pure single target, therefore has actually a relatively high damage compared to the sort of flashier big AoE skills.
Yeah.
And the funny thing about that then is that when it comes to boss design, you have to make sure that, as Mark was saying, that you can't just default attack it, that being the strongest thing. Yeah. And the way that needs to happen is you need to make sure that both that it relies even more heavily on making sure that there's interesting comboing stuff that you can do to make it so that you want to weave in all sorts of other stuff around that. But also it means that boss AI becomes even more important. And then there's also other challenges that things like flasks. So what we found when we made that melee default attack change was suddenly flasks were too good, because it was too easy to just sit there, face tank the boss and just flask through it. Like if you had 5 health flasks, you could, that became actually the best way to kill a boss, which is ridiculous, of course. So then you suddenly get into it's a whole thing. And this is a really challenging problem, and it's actually really hard to get around it. But how do you make, especially when it comes to new players, because for a new player, you need flasks to be good enough that they can kind of deal with whatever they need to be dealing with. But at the same time, if you make them weak such that you can't just sit there default attacking and using flasks if you put 5 of them on the bar, then they become also so weak that it becomes hard for new players to be able to deal with things. So this has been a real challenge and something that we've had to fiddle around a lot with. We found after this change we had to start making the default attacks of bosses also much higher. So that it punishes you just standing there for too long if you're not blocking and doing other things. So there's a bunch of those changes as well.
The other change that did also come alongside that, which it's crazy how you can follow go down the rabbit hole with these things, is we have just officially decided you are not portaling out of boss fights anymore. So no more going to town and coming back, because again, it is just run 5 life flasks, default attack the moment you're down to a couple, you portal out, portal back in, back to full life resource.
So we have to avoid that stuff for sure.
所以其实之前他们说的他们之前的这个战斗展示里面都是说你可以这个戳回城，现在右下角那个回城键嘛，你可以在战斗里面戳回城，然后里边它戳回城有个动作。有一个比较长的动作，然后你就可以考虑在 BOSS 这个硬直的时候去戳回城，然后去补充你的药剂什么的，回来继续战斗。那现在是完全不允许的，不好说。感觉一些 BOSS 会很难，就是那种就是阶段特别多的，然后你的输出不是特别够，把血瓶什么喝干了之后就会特别难受。
There was also things like, for example, we were finding that melee classes now didn't have enough life. So then we're like, okay, we need to find a way to solve that problem. We don't have life on the passive tree anymore. We've now made it so that the life you get from strength is way higher. Then we started okay, we need to make the mana higher. Intelligence. It's just started rippled out into this massive giant balanced storm of things that was crazy. And I remember Mark sent me a list of the list of systems that were fully rebalanced in a week in result of all of this stuff, and it was freaking 12 things long, and they're major things. I don't even remember half this.
Yeah, so then the question is how do you make a melee good? And then it's well, we changed 50 systems, and you don't really connect them implicitly, but they all do connect. Let alone the fact that the bosses and the monsters themselves take a very intricate amount of work to make sure that they are good against both ranged and close range archetypes. I certainly always try to make sure that close range is the preferable spot to stand, even if you are a ranged character, generally, and I find that to be the case anyway, generally because like the moment something is, say, tracking, so if it goes to swing and it will track for a certain amount of time and then unleash, you have to obviously run less of a distance the closer you are. So
Geometry.
It's easy to get behind them. You can see better. You can see the telegraphing. Like if you have the boss kind of half off screen.
那我懂了，锐眼零点射击也是近战，该启动攻近战了，零点射击。
You're not going to see it, right? So just from a purely visibility sake, being in close range is preferable. But yeah, something that we're definitely doing a lot more is like fight the boss several times, being completely in point blank, and then fight the boss several times at ranged, and then adapt the AI in both cases and just get it to feel perfectly right against both. It is okay for it to be slightly asymmetric, where sometimes you want to change what you're doing, and that is done by design. But it's certainly a lot more involved now than, and mostly from lessons learned over time, but a lot of the early Path of Exile 1 stuff would never have gone through this level of, rigorous iteration.
I feel like you've got at least 5 major scenarios you need to be worrying about. You've got the sort of the close range, the far away, the sort of minion case, the party case, and there's like, there has to be, was that 5?
Yep.
I don't know.
The minion case was huge. Now it is, again, the case generally in POE 1, we do a pass on the balance of damage against minions, but like here we're doing like, how does this fight feel against minions? What are they targeting? And then, in party player, you don't want like a boss to be target switching too often and stuff like that. So yeah, it's kind of a lot. Like the AI pass on bosses is a lot more involved than it used to be. And we're considering as many of the archetypes as possible when doing it. And it makes things take longer, but it feels so much better.
And the kind of crazy thing about that is that like, even now, when we've played through Act 1 so many times, every time we play through it, there's still a bunch of notes about like more AI changes to make to the bosses. It's actually outrageous the amount of like things you need to do to get it to actually be right through that whole thing. It's crazy.
I imagine you have to consider carefully like how much a boss pushes a melee character out of melee and for how long.
I'm actually a proponent of more pushing. A lot of the I think that it makes attacks, especially now that, okay, so actually this was something that happened as a result of blocking, and I think maybe even in the build that you were playing just now, we hadn't done as much of the stuff yet, because when you block an attack, if there wasn't a push on that attack and it's a melee attack, it feels really underwhelming. So we've had to add a lot more pushes on boss melees and things like that in order to make it so that blocking it actually feels satisfying and so on. And it doesn't feel like when you've got a hit reaction from the player, that was enough to make it feel fine. But once you add the blocking in and you've got that, it's like suddenly a hit that you've just blocked and you've gotten a hit reaction on isn't good enough anymore. So like that immediately also changes another thing. And it's like, oh, I tell Mark, hey, we need to do another pass through all the bosses' melees again, to go and do all of the set all this stuff up now. And it's like, yeah,
we've got this massive checklist of how to set up a boss, and like it started with like 300 different points.
但是我犯法说我这远程我也可以带个盾吧，不知道那个拿矛能不能带盾。感觉要是可以的话，那其实大家也都能够享受到格挡的好处，并不只是这个近战。
Then honestly, it's up to like 500 now, and every time you add a thing to it, you got to go back through every single one, do it all again, and like, yeah. So it's just a lot and a lot and a lot of iteration until everything just feels absolutely flawless.
I think big thing, and this relates to bosses for melee, is how well can you punish that moment when you create that moment. So whether that's either you've got the new stun and stagger system, heavy stun, super important for melee, I think, especially. So obviously melee is better for that sort of thing as well. Like it has more stun build up.
Yeah.
And then like how do you punish that? Like does melee have the tools to punish that? Is something you've thought about a lot?
For sure. So I mean that just comes down to all the various combos that you can do. So we have to make sure that obviously we want to make sure that every class has some level of combo gameplay going on, but for melee it is ultra important that you've got big attacks that you can do, like big combinations of things. So like we're thinking about that when we're doing skill design. There are more skills like coming for warrior, even for doing that stuff. It's like you need to make sure that there's like several multiplicative factors that you can do, but only if the boss is not actively attacking you, so that you can kind of get so that you can prepare all that stuff and then get it off, so you can kind of get that moment of like, yeah, that heavy stun really was meaningful. I want to get that because it's going to be the thing that's going to allow me to do the huge amounts of damage that that like, and then like turn the boss fight around. So it's ultra important.
Melee do inherently stun more, as you said, and on the passive tree, of course, you can invest into it. And then physical damage also has an advantage over elemental damage.
But also bigger hits do more stun relative to smaller hits as well.
Yep. So you certainly do control, and of course melee weapons do have higher damage than ranged weapons. So yeah, melee has certainly.
所以 POE 的近战改动其实也是 POE2搬过来的，这样吗？
all the damage advantage, and it's then just, are you good enough to maintain the uptime, or have you spent defensively enough that you can, get as much DPS uptime as you can. And honestly, like, we've done internal tests with our whole team, and at the end of it, it's very much a like, you have a lot of normally you'd see things where it's a lot of range characters and stuff like that. It was fully like warrior monk, warrior monk, warrior, warrior monk on the ladder, like we certainly have.
That's a good sign.
Yeah, all our melee characters pushing it. You could argue maybe it's gone too far in that direction, but everyone was enjoying it. Like, it certainly feels good and feels fun. So like, just internally, I would say, and just with people actually playing this, and I mean for a decent amount of time, like, everyone's having a very, very good time on melee. So whatever we're doing is working, I'll tell you that. Feels ultra satisfying.
I think it's starting to get really close in the boss fights, in that you've got that stun and then you've got that moment to pull off that ability combo or that charge up ability that does a big hit, and that feels really satisfying. Like, I think it's getting close. Something I noticed where it might be missing, and it's still maybe something you're exploring, is against swarms of enemies, against those packs of enemies. How do you deal with the idea, like, melee characters inherently much more vulnerable to getting surrounded, especially as you've lent into this idea that Path of Exile 2 has a lot more body blocking, and where you are and where the enemies are is so much more important. So how do you make that feel good for melee?
So there's a few things going on with this. So one of them is we have to make sure that stun is good enough that you can pretty reliably stun groups of enemies as you approach them. So we've got a few different tools for that. Like, if you're one hand, so that you've got less damage, then we need to make sure the shield is able to do that kind of thing. So you've got the shield charge and stuff like that. You can, generally speaking, kind of get a stun off as you arrive at a pack, so that you don't have the incoming damage being too high. The other thing as well is, for two-hand, is you kind of have those like slower attacks that kind of, as you arrive, they do a large amount. You can get the sort of stuns off there. So sort of the intention is that you are able to stun those like swarmier groups like that. But then it just also comes down to balance of defenses. And one of the things that, once again, wasn't in the build that you played, you did a full rebalance of the way that defenses work. I mentioned about the life change and like but armor's changing. Like, there's a lot of things like that. Like, all of these defensive systems have to change as well. There's actually quite large defensive changes, even just generally across all classes, even outside of melee, happening, because there was actually a few things that I realized where one thing that's really important to me, once again for good combat, is you need clarity on anything that's going to matter for your defenses. You need clarity from the monster about what that is. So the most obvious example of this is that we're making sure we're not like going too wild with different colors. Like, we have to make sure the colors and damage types are really associated really well. So previously we would have done like, oh, this like thing has like fire that looks like a different color because it's like a theme. No, like, we actually don't want to do that. We want to make sure that fire is the color that it is, and if you see that color, you know it's fire damage, and therefore you know that your resistance is, whether or not your resistance is going to apply to that. But there was one actually that I thought was kind of bad in this regard, which is spells versus attacks. It's very unclear on an incoming sense whether something is a spell or an attack. You can kind of tell, like, maybe, but like I don't think it was clear enough, and so we actually decided to remove the distinction between spells and attacks from monsters attacking you, which means that like any defensive option would distinguish this no longer does anymore, and that's something that I think is an improvement overall. And
格挡也不用分攻击还是法术了，
So that
都这样子。
implies things like evasion.
Yep,
Previously,
so evasion,
that
evasion works.
闪避也可以作为法术啊。
so there's no distinction anymore between a spell and attack on a monster, so therefore evasion works against them. Instead, what we have is things like evasion. If you have an attack from the ground or the sky, then evasion can't evade that. So like, if a slam is not evadable, but anything that isn't like that comes from the front or from,
所以我们猛击人也不用这个运动嘛。
the kind of thing where like it makes it much like. there are still rules to know, but it is like much more immediately visible whether or not something is going to be available and so on. And like, you know, it's the same goes with block, where like now generally the rule is trying to be, if it looks blockable, it is, and that means once again it's similar rules to evasion, right? If it comes from the front, like rather than below or above you, then it's blockable, and as long as you're facing that direction, you can block it. So that kind of stuff is you know, is pretty important.
The active blocking is certainly a big change and very powerful feeling, especially in boss fights. How do you want it to feel in boss fights versus against swarms of enemies?
Yeah, so the trouble is, of course, with blocking is that if you've got a swarm of enemies, then blocking isn't really helping you because you don't have an opening to take advantage of the block. Now, there are skills, like retaliation skills, later on that sort of do aid with that. But generally speaking, it's going to be the big enemies where blocking matters, and I think it should be.
对，我会觉得这个 POE 的反击技能还是太奇怪了。如果放 POE2里面的框架的话，会好非常多因为有这个格挡条和这个你举盾都是必定格挡的这样的一个设定。POE1 因为反击有这个75的这个大概上限，然后你只能去堆上限或者用幸运格挡的方式来提高它，玩起来是有一种便秘感。但是 POE2 的话，你只要你举盾就能够去尝试去释放反击技能，这点我觉得非常重要。
That way. Like I don't necessarily want you to feel like you're just blocking all the time. The thing that I will say though is that it is the intention in POE2 that a lot more white monsters rise to the like level of being a thing that have big attacks that you'd want to block. Like there's, you know, like we've got much more monsters that are like big and you want to, you know, like not so much at the beginning of Act 1, but especially as you go through, we've got like, you know, like here's a giant elephant that's like a white monster, and you know, like you're going to want to probably block that thing, and because it's going to do a huge amount of damage to you, you know what I mean? So that kind of stuff, like even in Act 1 you've got things like there's those vampires that do these big like spear storms at you, and it's like that is a thing you're going to want to block because they don't use it very often. It does a huge amount of damage. We have to make sure that there are big damaging but not incoming hits with big telegraphs that happen even on white monsters, and if we do that, then blocking is something that you're going to want to be doing in every area, even aside from the boss fights, just for certain things.
Yeah, if those are things that aren't being like spammed at you, but they're the sort of thing you come across occasionally that's still dangerous from regular monsters, and that could work well to change up that gameplay a lot, right?
So yeah, with something like those vampires, it's like they're in packs of one with a bunch of like minions and things like that. Nice. You're not gonna. I mean, unless two packs happen to overlap and you happen to get to it once, it's very unlikely that you'd need to be dealing with that kind of stuff multiple times. And even when that does happen, we do have a system of global cooldowns where when a monster uses a skill, it puts all other monsters of the same type on that same skill on the same cooldown, and that can mean that you don't have to deal with the same thing multiple times, even across different monsters.
So pack and monster design is key for melee 100%. Gameplay feel as well. Then.
And I think that this is also something where POE2 is way better than POE1 with the monsters, is that the variety of interest you get from all the monsters all through the game, like, you know, from the very beginning to the end is much better. And I think it's going to be really interesting when we get to maps, the variety you're going to see when you start mix and matching all those monster packs with all those different abilities across, you know, like once they're randomly in the areas as well.
Something I noticed in like, especially in pack gameplay, is that you have a lot of these skills that are designed to be tools for specific situations. So whether it's to armor break something or if it's to punish a big stun, and these situations aren't coming up as much when you're dealing with large swarms of enemies. So I sometimes felt at a loss at what I was kind of supposed to be doing in that situation.
I guess that's just a matter of making sure we're getting the balance correct. Like if you're talking about things like what's it called, the stun
Bone Shatter.
If you're talking about things like Bone Shatter, like basically the idea would be to try and get monsters into that range. Like there are skills and tools that we have that you know that ideally you'd be using to be able to get things into the range to be able to do the stun. But I mean that's a matter of build design. I do think that it's good because of the way the skill system works now. It's okay to have skills you don't use very often. This was definitely not the case in POE1, where you didn't want to have any sort of dead skills on your character really that you weren't using constantly. In POE2 you can definitely have like, I'm using these 4 skills most of the time, but then I've got these other things occasionally for certain cases, and that's fine because you've got 9 skill slots plus extra skills you're getting from you know, from weapons and weapon swap and so on. So like that's sort of okay and intended, and it just allows for you know, just a bit more variety and having things that just come up occasionally and then you use them.
Yeah, that gives you more tools to play with as a melee character for different situations.
There are of course also melee characters not like the monk, for example, still melee, very much not relying on stun, but more on freeze. You very comfortably often get the thing where you can freeze a whole pack and then just do something real epic and shatter all of them. Same applies to even the sorceress. I know, not melee, but Ice Nova's still very close proximity. You still get the same awesome satisfaction out of that as well. Some classes can do it slightly better than others, but yeah, I think ultimately that does certainly come down to balance. And just one note from me on the monster front, like we are taking very special care to make sure every area we're asking the question, what are the blockable monsters in this area? What are the big monsters you're actually thinking about and engaging? And this becomes more prevalent as you get further into the game. And like it's made and combined with the fact we have so many monsters of every variety possible, I don't think any area feels the same as any other area. Which is real awesome. But yeah, we are very much now, again, we did all like several acts of monsters before we even introduced the active block mechanic. So now we go back through everything again and go, all right, well, we have to make melee feel good. So we will change the monsters in half the areas, we'll adapt to this and change this, add skills here, and like all of a sudden, because we add one mechanic, we have to add like 60 monster skills, and yeah,
I think that's why I wanted to explore deep diving melee here with you, is because it holds such a lens up to everything you're doing design-wise. It really puts a fine-tooth comb over everything you're doing here. The default attacking, is that something that you're intending to be used pretty consistently long term, or is it more of like an early game situation as a gap filler?
It is something that you'll be using, I think, through the game. I wouldn't want you to think that it's like, 2/3 of your attacks are going to be default attacks or something like that, but it is something that does make sense to be using, I think. And as I said, like because it's supportable, because we've got a lot of interesting support gems that you can do with it. Like it can serve as your, for example, like if you're not otherwise doing freeze, it could serve as your freezer if you're using the right supports with it. It could serve as like a way to bleed enemies. It could serve as a way to blind enemies. It could serve, like there's all sorts of things you could do to kind of like use it as a way to sort of do something else in addition to just doing some damage.
Yeah, so when people
所以平 A 伤害不会特别高，但是你可以拿它挂给敌人挂一些状态啊什么的，然后你可以用这个特定的这个技能来引爆这些状态。比如说冰冻应该有引爆的方式啊，比如说这个感电应该有这种就是给它处理方式。挺有意思的设计。
People hear default attack right now, they think like the boring thing that occurs when I can't do other stuff that I don't want to do. But it sounds like you're trying to make more of a blank slate skill here, a build your own skill almost.
For sure.
So how much room are you giving to playing with like how it physically functions then? How it feels to use that actual skill?
I mean, ultimately it is like a like a basic hit animation, but I think that there is perfectly room to do that. And like in POE1, just a basic hit I don't think felt good enough to really sort of understand that. But in POE2, that feeling of just hitting a monster is a lot better. And even in the, if you're talking about something like the staff attack, like you've got the step attack in there, so you're like moving towards the monster as you do it. Like there's all that sort of stuff going on with it as well. So just overall, I mean, like I feel this is actually another one as well. Is like if you you need to be able to make just a basic attack feel good, or what are you even doing, if you know what I mean? Like
if you can't get that right.
If you can't get that right, then what are you getting right? You know what I mean? It's like, so that to me, like I feel like I just enjoy even just the experience of just hitting monsters on that level.
I'm a big fan of that design approach of making a game feel good at the most fundamental level of pushing a button and thing happen.
Right.
Yep.
For sure.
If you out of mana and you go to use a skill, is default attack then something that it's going to automatically use? Because I noticed that wasn't a thing.
I think
in my testing
that
earlier.
We turned that off, and that was because once again default attack is more of a skill now in that sense. So I think that we don't currently do that. We have a more clear out of mana indicator now.
It is. But it still creates that interruption in your gameplay. I think that's not very fun.
It does. But I actually, when default attack replacement was happening, I had that feeling of losing control of my character, which I didn't like of it not doing the thing I expected, which obviously you're going to get if you run out of mana, but it felt like worse to have a thing that because then it's like now to interrupt that, you'd have to do a dodge roll or something. Like there's, it felt like losing control, and I didn't like that. It felt a lot better to me to just make sure that we didn't do that anymore. So that behavior, I think, was something that needed to be removed.
Is that too fundamental to what you're designing there to be an option that you can toggle?
I mean, I suppose we could do that. There's nothing really, but yeah, to me it just feels worse. So yeah,
I wonder if it's a preference thing or not.
We're certainly at the point where it's as we're talking about, get the fundamentals right, and it's very easy to cop out of getting things right and then to add options. And so we're making sure we take back all the options, get it right, and then we'll reevaluate what's needed then. Otherwise, again, like. Yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with, like, I wanted to do X and my character now is doing Y. I didn't want it to do that. So, like, I certainly prefer fully that it's just like, tell me I'm out of mana, don't, like, pathfind me up there, don't attack on the spot.
所以现在魔力耗尽了也不会自动攻击。
I wanted to seize this opportunity to do the skill. Yes.
应该怎么说呢？就是如果比如说 boss 眩晕了，然后刚好没蓝了啊，我想打一个大的这个攻击，然后它就会给我变成平 A 的话，确实会感觉让人很难受。按出去那个，如果按了没蓝之后，如果我有蓝药的话，我会按蓝药。但是如果变成自动攻击的话，确实有一种传达不是很一致的感觉。这点上我部分同意他们的想法吧。
I failed to make sure I had enough mana, and so I will give me the fail indicator and let me reevaluate what I want to do. Instead of making me do something that I didn't decide to do. I think it's very important, very, very important you don't ever, if you input something, you don't do something that you didn't input. That might not have mattered so much with the high frequency of POE1 because you can get through that attack then very quickly and then recalibrate, but like time matters and decisions matter when you've got single life combat, single life boss of things going on and you want to dodge the skill and all of a sudden you're doing something you didn't sign up for. It can have a lot more, ramifications for your time, I guess, by having the wrong thing happen. So I'm a huge proponent of changing that. We'll see how it goes at the end of the day. I would say that's something that actually hasn't come up from other people. I think in general, people have been pretty happy with
one noticed it until you
probably maybe not.
One other thing, by the way, just as a random side note, we are actually adding a miss indicator so that you can tell when you miss. It isn't like a piece of text next to the monster. It's actually just above the life bar, or like on the life bar of the monster that you're highlighting, so you can see there if you're missing a target. Which
it does a swoosh or something.
It's got like a little just miss piece of text that appears in the life bar, and so that way we don't have it like in the play field where it kind of is immersion breaking. It's kind of
having some sort of feedback there.
But that is important because, it's something that if you can just not realize that you're missing, and then
I didn't notice myself miss any major attack, which I noted was important given that each skill usage is much more important.
So for melee, you shouldn't really be missing until later on, and even then, mostly it should just be evasive monsters. Like generally speaking, if you're just like progressing through, you probably and you're playing melee, you're probably not missing anything unless it's a highly evasive dex monster, and then you should be able to solve that problem even by just allocating some dex. But yeah, if you're a ranger, different situation. You do need to be the dex should be solving this for you, but you do need to keep up with the dex to make sure that you're doing that.
I think it makes sense too that in melee it feels like you're physically hitting the monster, so for them to just be like miss, it doesn't really feel right.
For sure.
But for like an arrow shot or something, then that's maybe a bit more reasonable.
And it does affect melee in cases where you have skills that hit from further away. So if you've got some kind of some sort of pseudo ranged melee stuff, then because it's based on distance, that matters for that too.
So 以现在的命中系统是你离怪越远的话，你越容易那个未命中，然后你离怪越近，它这个命中惩罚就越小，有点意思。
Accuracy can come into play in those kind of situations.
How is mana an important part of the puzzle here for melee, and how do you make it feel good? I noticed there was a much bigger difference in the cost of skills. Some were very expensive, and whereas in Path of Exile 1, it's much more about generally, can you spam this skill or can you not?
Right. So, we want to actually make mana cost meaningful, but it is so hard to get this right. And honestly, it might be one of the things that had the most arguments about this internally. Like,
that's tough.
Honestly, I don't even know how to really answer this because, other than to say we want mana to be meaningful for both melee and and spellcasters. The one thing that POE2 does do, I don't think POE1 does this, is that mana costs are now paid over the duration of the use of the skill.
You can cancel
And,
mana cost.
so that means you can cancel without mana loss, but also means that if a monster interrupts you, the cost doesn't quite feel quite so punitive.
Getting stunned out.
Exactly. So that kind of thing has kind of helped as well. But it means that those long attacks, they can have quite large mana costs, but they pay.
You enter a payment program, like a loan repayment system for them.
That.
I mean, we generally still have your cookie cutters are much cheaper.
Yep.
Support gems have less impact on mana than they do in PoE1.
Yes.
There are obviously ways to invest into mana and all that, but the main also thing is you don't have all of your mana reserved, right? You actually have this resource in this game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're using that full bar now.
And the costs do grow as you level them up, but I think generally melee skills gain more damage per level in PoE2 than, say, in PoE1.
Yep.
And of course, we kind of look at each skill and we're like, how often are you expected or really going to use this? If it is a big finisher, right, it is kind of cost higher because the expectations you're using it as a finisher, such that if you are just spamming it, you're probably not going to have a rough time. So it is a factor that you do need to consider when looking at the skills, and I'd say mostly it's going to be a little bit jarring coming from PoE1 to 2 if people make that transition. Very, very, very different mana ecosystems, and I suspect it's more going to be people getting used to it. Like I think if a new player starting will be very, very they'll analyze that and be okay with it. But it's more the jarring jump from one game to the other that I suspect is going to catch people up.
And it's really just the reservations, I would say, is like, because you're expected to have the resource, that just changes the thing. Like we never, PoE1, just due to the way it evolved, didn't have that expectation. So therefore, you often have the mana, and therefore the costs of melee attacks were very cheap. And so then we couldn't differentiate, like we couldn't make a skill powerful in PoE1 because it used a lot of mana, because that just wasn't okay. And now in PoE2, that is a thing we can do. We can say the skill is powerful, but it used a lot of mana.
Something with melee is that you have.
就我想知道一件事情，就是这个法术这个魔力偷取这个东西还有没有用啊？就是这个游戏的偷取其实是怎么作用的？因为现在基本上解决蓝号的问题都是靠一点偷取，然后点一个10%的瞬息专精嘛，然后就靠那个顺偷的数值来给你回。所以如果这个东西没有的话，我觉得影响还是最大的。
Have a bunch of different archetypes or power fantasies that you can fulfill with that. Like you have, the paladin with the big shield, the knight or whatever. You have the two-handed, kind of marauder. What sort of archetypes of power fantasies are you looking to fulfill here?
I mean, we are looking to do all of the ones that you typically see in games, and we have a lot of classes. We haven't shown, honestly, like melee being some of the hardest stuff to make. Some of the other melee classes that we haven't shown, that fulfill some of those other sort of fantasies, haven't really been talked about. People know what the class names are, but like obviously, if you're thinking about the whole like big shield, like defensive thing, like the Templar is something that you imagine, could be fulfilling that. So, and then of course we've got the duelist and so on. There's things, there's other stuff going on with that.
Of course, we haven't even gotten into the ascendancy classes, right? Like those allow you to fulfill even more.
升华，赶紧放出来，升华。
into a gladiator or something else.
So there's still more of those melee archetypes to come. We've kind of got the the slam stuff, and we've got the kind of the fast moving staff monk thing going on as the two that we're kind of showing, that we've showed so far.
现在展示一快一个慢。
we want to have like all those different archetypes, by the time we're releasing.
So I walked away from my exploration of Path of Exile 2's melee pretty excited and keen for more time with it. I was on a highly experimental and thus quite unstable internal build, and we had a few issues, so I couldn't really sink as many hours in as I wanted to, but I got to at least see a little deeper into what they're trying to achieve, and the most recent vision of that. I was particularly taken with the weapon automatic switching, which I tried to play around with as much as I could, even before kind of technically unlocking the extra support for it in the game where you get a second passive tree and the ability to manually set skills. You can still use it before that point even. And the new build options that opened was really interesting. I got to mess, for example, with a big two-hander to punish bosses, and then swapping to a shield automatically by pressing my active block skill when I needed it. And on the monk, I even messed around with using a spellcasting staff to build freezes up with an Ice Nova gem that I carved before auto-swapping to the quarterstaff when I wanted to melee to finish off those frozen mobs. The monk in particular started
你
to
可以
feel
玩
really
真正的
fast.
法术跟攻击混合，只要切换武器跟这个东西联动起来的话，好有意思。但是天赋上有没有相关的支持的？这样子一般会导致这个你投入那个法术伤害什么的，都会导致你攻击伤害很弱，然后这个暴击率也很难一块堆起来。就只可能说通过套用的方式啊，什么法术它伤害套到攻击上边，就比如说这个 POE 里边最近跟最近的这个改动的这个法杖类的这个攻击都有这个法伤的套用，这种东西才能够去把它兼容一下。
Fascinating to me, the deeper I went with it. With so many options for how you actually like engage a pack and how you could combo abilities together. Like surface level, there's explicit combinations like building frenzies with a palm strike and then dropping them into a massive lightning strike for very big, satisfying, flashy gameplay moments. But it went a lot deeper when I started to explore how I could use all of the different tools to manage different kind of packs and different kind of encounters. It didn't ever feel like I was just doing a kind of set skill rotation. I think you will develop a few of those sorts of things, but it felt like I was using a lot more things contextually based on what was actually going on in the gameplay. That personally allays one of my fears about kind of combo-oriented gameplay, that it will devolve into just pressing the same buttons in sequence, for example. I felt like there was a lot more potential for it to be much more dynamic instead. I feel like in Path of Exile 1, I do 90% of my theory crafting and path of building. And I don't think that's going away with Path of Exile 2, nor would I really want it to. I love that aspect of the game. But I do feel that I'm going to be spending a greater percentage of my theory crafting time in Path of Exile actually in-game, testing and experimenting with the physical act of playing my character. I'll have to figure out with each new build kind of how I handle the moment-to-moment gameplay and when I use certain skills, and that will be a far larger part of the build creation than it's been in the past. It's not a...
在游戏内里边去反复试验这些 BD 的话，我也觉得是更加符合直觉的这些东西，也能够让更多人参与进来，而不是说你在 POB 里边改来改去什么的。这个事情其实是应该说是新玩家进入这个游戏的最大的门槛之一，就是你会发现这个游戏所有的基本上 99% 的研究都是在 POB 里边先点一下完成的，然后之后才搬到游戏里边来。这个赛季我试了一下几个 BD 不跑 POB 的感觉还是差点意思啊，到后边还是需要进 POB 里面微调。所以我是蛮期待 POE2 里边说就是能够让你更直接去在游戏里边去做出来一些反馈跟决定的这样的一个的决定跟反馈的这样的一个这个循环，而不是说非得要用一个第三方工具。
Unusual to see a build video for a Path of Exile 1 build that doesn't really even have a section about how you physically play the build. That's not that rare, but I think that section of the video will be much more important, and at least always be there in Path of Exile 2 build guides.
这里还有一个很奇怪的一点，就是很糟糕的一点，就是有些 BD 什么吹起来满天，然后这个你一看 POB 也是哇什么超高伤害、超高防御什么的，实际玩起来一头狗屎。这个也是很不一致的东西。你通过 POB 来判断一个 BD 的话，也不是一个很好的判断方式，不太直观。并且你也有很多这个坑啊什么的，比如说他状态调了什么东西啊，他写辅助写了什么东西之类的，这些东西都能满足吗？实际战斗中，所以有很多水分啊什么的，这个东西也会导致你实际玩起来感受也不一样。比如说他这个伤害很大情况下是吼上去的或者水上去的，比如说副手切个红刃盾啊这些东西，然后吼一下那个什么怒火吼这种东西，这个东西就手感就很恶心。然后你实际上如果你不想做这个东西的话，手感确实回来一点，但是你的伤害就没了。甚至是 BD 都没办法运作，比如说还有怒火手啊之类的。所以我也其实也不是很喜欢用 POB 这个纯粹的来进行 BD 制作。我觉得在游戏内里边去还原是更好的。所以我是蛮希望他们有一个像火炬那样子的，就是能够直接一键导出你角色啊，这样然后有一个大概展示的，这样一键导入 BD， 然后给其他人看游戏里面的加点啊什么的乱七八糟的东西。其实这里边的反馈会更加直接一些，但是我觉得 GG 应该不会做类似的东西，但是至少说你能够在 POE2 里边能够更加直接的在游戏里边进行 BD 这个测试的话，会更加舒服一些。
And I'm very excited for that strange new world. I suspect there's also the potential that builds will become a bit more personal in POE2 as well, because each person will probably handle how they use those different skills a bit more differently than they do in Path of Exile 1. What really defines Path of Exile 2's melee experience right now for me is the combo of having a vast arsenal of skills that you get to figure out when and how to use, and a lot more actual movement in your gameplay. You actively avoid enemy attacks, reposition, and move while you're attacking, most importantly. Going beyond, way beyond, just basic stutter stepping. I've always felt like Melee should be like the most dynamic and interesting gameplay in action RPGs, but typically it's the least, it's the most static quite often, centered around kind of standing still and channeling or using a skill and face tanking, typically. Path of Exile 2 is much closer to what I imagined as an ideal for this genre. It's a very dynamic experience that's pretty damn challenging, to be honest, but also hands you a lot more control over actually what's happening in the game. I don't doubt that one skill blasting builds that just face tank and stand there are going to exist. Like, I will think they'll still be there and they'll still be popular, but there's going to be a lot more options for us to actually make gameplay more interesting if we want to, and plenty of reward for making use of those options, I think. That's exciting for any playstyle, but for Melee in particular, I think it's the biggest change. It was great to critique the game through that lens, and honestly, I felt plenty of points of friction when I did so. There's still plenty of kinks for them to work out, but at the same time, I got a far more intimate look at what they're doing right now and how far they're pushing Path of Exile 2 beyond what Path of Exile 1 has done. I don't think they're just playing it safe here. That's it for the moment, but I've got a lot more of our chats with the devs to come out in the near future, talking about campaign design and some other really interesting changes to the core gameplay, so keep an eye out for those videos popping up in your sub feed. That's it for now, I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.
也感谢大家收看，感觉这个他们真的是聊了很多关于细节上面的这些东西，那我就是真的是等不及要玩了，也不知道他们这些改动到底是好还是不好，这些东西只能交给玩家评判，所以赶紧开测试，只有玩家才有验收资格，对吧？